All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to ASBMB's Communicating Science for Advocacy webinar. My name is Kevin Gardner. I'm a faculty member at the City University of New York, or CUNY Advanced Science Research Center in the City College of New York, and I'll be moderating today's session. We're excited to have you join us as we explore strategies for effectively communicating your research as an advocate for science and provide guidance on scheduling a congressional meeting in your home district with tips for a successful meeting. Before we begin, I'd like to offer two quick reminders. Number one, you can submit questions at any time using the Q&A feature you can see located in a button at the bottom of the Zoom window. We'll take those questions as the seminar goes or as the talks go along and address them in Q&A sessions after each speaker's presentation. Number two, I want to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded, and recordings of this session will be available on the ASBMB website after we're done. All right, with that, you know who I am, you know the ground rules for what we're doing. It's now my pleasure to get on to the main event, which is to introduce today's two speakers. Our first speaker is Dr. Amy J. Hawkins, who is an assistant professor at the University of Utah School of Medicine, where she directs a graduate certificate in personalized medicine. She has previously worked as a postdoctoral fellow at the Genetic Science Learning Center, known for its widely used life science website. Dr. Hawkins also has experience in public advocacy, having run for Salt Lake City Council, District 5, and chaired her local community council. The second speaker is Sean Gallagher, who's been with the American Association for the Advancement of Science, AAAS, since 2015, handling a wide range of policy issues and leading grassroots efforts to engage scientists in advocacy. Prior to joining AAAS, he spent over 7 years on Capitol Hill as a legislative aide for multiple members of Congress, working on science policy and public engagement. With that, let's please welcome Dr. Amy Hawkins, who will begin our discussion on effective science communication and advocacy. Dr. Hawkins, the floor is yours.
Hello, hello. Can we hear me?
Absolutely.
Oh, terrific. Thank you. What a delight to join you all today, and thank you all for caring about these issues. This is definitely outside of a lot of folks' expertise and what people think of as their day job. So today, I'm going to talk a little bit about how to communicate with policymakers and elected officials to advocate for science. As said, I'm grateful to be a member of the ASBMB Science Outreach and Communication Committee, and I'm a faculty member at the University of Utah School of Medicine. Today, I am definitely not speaking on behalf of my employer, and I encourage you to grab hold of that phrase and feel free to use it yourself. Second, you've already heard a little bit about me, but I thought I'd establish my credibility with you, my audience, about why I was invited to participate. In my free time in my free time in the past 8 to 9 years, I've served as a community advocate in Salt Lake City. I regularly work with local and state leaders, and in 2021, I did run for city council, although I did not win. I now have quite a bit of experience talking to our state level legislator, and have some experience in getting education appropriations for science-based curriculum in Utah high schools. There are a bit more masks involved in 2021 than are represented here in these photos. Also, probably like several folks on this call, I've been active in organizing our state's Stand Up for Science rally. So I hope that's something that lots of you can identify with here. But before we get any further and talk about the how with communicating with policymakers, I want to acknowledge a little bit about the why. And some of those reasons probably have changed for lots of us recently. Even if some of us have been at this for years, or made it the entire focus of our careers, it's not business as usual right now. Even if issues may be tied up in courts, we've seen universities and individuals have seen their grants canceled. Trainees and postdocs and even faculty members may no longer feel safe with regards to their immigration status. And I'm saying all this because I really want to acknowledge that the effects of these situations can be extremely destabilizing. And you may not approach these situations just because you're advocating for science. You might be advocating for the ability for you to continue working at all in science. And your concerns may feel existential. You probably and justifiably have a lot of strong feelings about science, and you might be furious. Um, when you think about the how to speak with policymakers and their staff, you have to be strategic about how many of those very strong feelings you check at the door so you can do your best to make your case. In addition, not unlike what I said a minute or two ago, please protect yourself. I want you to be aware of what your institution's guidelines and limitations on political speech are. On the bottom of that slide, I stuck my own email signature that's on my personal email address, not my university address. So I always convey to people with every single email that I'm writing on my personal behalf and not behalf of the university. If you're in a whole different category of folks who, are professional communicators for your university, that's different. But I encourage you to seek those folks at your university out, seek out your staff council, seek out your faculty council to understand what are the guidelines and how can you make sure that you won't be accused of misrepresenting. Okay. I want to say today that probably the other ideas that I'm going to be conveying, a lot of these are borrowed from the ASBMB's Art of Science Communication class, which was created about 10 years ago by the Science Outreach and Communication Committee, and we've been revising it ever since. Essentially, we think there's a lack of accessible science communication training programs geared towards non-expert audiences. And that's what we're talking about today. How to communicate with non-expert audiences. Next, I want to address what if you've seen messaging that science might not be, you might think that science just isn't a concern for your representatives, either at the state or the federal level. What if your own political representation just seems to not match your beliefs? This was something I worried about where I'm from in the state of Utah. We have a legislative supermajority that doesn't quite match up with some of the beliefs that some scientists I know hold. But I would strongly encourage you, don't give up before you've tried. Even if you aren't from the same political party, there's often lots of opportunity to establish mutual interests with either your representatives or their staff members. How do we think about that? Well, there's been a lot of rhetoric lately. If you work for a university, are you just a member of the ivory tower? What do I mean by that? Are you just living in a world of ideas that's separate from the realities of most people's lives? Are you wasting taxpayers' money? Are you just not engaged with real world problems and you're not interested in translating research into practical solutions? Of course not. Of course you're interested. That's why you're going to talk to your legislator. And are you going to talk to them as a member of the ivory tower? No, you're probably going to reach out to them as a constituent, somebody that they really care about, and somebody whom they can enlist in their problem solving. So this gets to a topic that I know Sean is going to cover. Who is your audience and what is their motivation for listening? You may be reaching out to your policymaker and making the case for science, but ultimately, who's the audience that you both will be working with? In the art of science communication, we often talk about different kinds of audiences, and I'm sure lots of people on this call have experience speaking to scientists in different fields or other specialties, patient groups and their families, school-age children, or working with teachers to develop extra curriculum, or even the general public. But policymakers fall into a slightly different category. And I would say it's because of their limited time. All of these other groups, I think you tend to have the luxury to explain and re-explain. But policymakers, especially if you approach them during a state legislative session, which if you happen to live in the state of Utah or the state of Virginia is only 45 days long, real crunch. You need to figure out how to communicate efficiently. Ultimately, one of the best ways to help your policymaker is to allow them to be the best politician they can be and to present your problems to them or to present your science to them in light of who votes in their district, right? What kinds of, not just the demographics of your district, but actually understanding who are the voters, because that's not always the same. What do they care about? Ultimately, your lawmakers have to sell their decisions back to their voters. So if you can highlight unintended consequences they might not have thought of, or the great economic benefits of your science to their district, you're making a real case for why they should enlist you as a partner in their policymaking. This gets to another concept that we're borrowing heavily from the art of science communication. You're probably going to need to frame and reframe your research in a new light than you've ever argued for in terms of any kind of grant proposal or to your dissertation committee. You're going to have to think about, how does your research or your university or the training programs that you participate in, how do they benefit your district, maybe in terms of an economic frame or an economic opportunity frame? How many folks from your district are going to get additional educational opportunities because of the work that you do? Finally, and this may be obvious, but you're going to have to eliminate your jargon. This is so hard. How many of us want to talk about the proteins that we're so passionate about studying? And while we're talking to our policymakers about that, they're probably going to be thinking of a hamburger or a chicken sandwich. I strongly recommend that you take some of your work and put it through a de-jargonizer AI tool, or, practice on your grandparents before you hit that strategic opportunity to talk to a policymaker. And last, before I pass off the mic, more than anything, this is the opportunity for you to establish relationships. If you are so fortunate to schedule a meeting with a policymaker or their staff members, or even just happen to find yourself in one in the hallways of Congress, use this as an opportunity to establish a relationship that you might be able to use in the future, and certainly never cut off that opportunity out of frustration or anger. It can be so exciting to revisit a relationship and find out that you actually can help in the political process. And you can never quite anticipate when this is going to come back around and help you. All right, that was a little shorter than I thought I might be, but I definitely want to leave time for questions. So Sean, can I pass this off to you? Or Kevin, I think that might actually be your job.
Yeah, I think it is. And at this point, I'd like to open the floor for some questions from the audience, and then we'll spend a few minutes there, and then we'll move over to Sean's remarks. Again, as I just posted over in the chat, Dr. Hawkins is glad to take questions. Please submit these using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window. First question came in, and it goes as follows. Hi, I would like to speak with the policymaker who has reached out, I think, to everyone in their district, but I honestly feel underprepared in terms of confidence stemming from my experience in academia. While I am growing and gaining confidence, is there a means or program or individual who'd be interested in providing some guidance here? Amy, thoughts?
definitely always am going to refer people to the art of science communication as an opportunity to really get that elevator pitch down, right? But I might also be tempted to reach out to the science communication professionals at your own institution. Those folks have lots of practice in crafting messages for, newspapers, radio pieces, press releases. Try out some of your words on them. And I think it's often part of their jobs to help you out.
Fantastic. Next question up. Are we allowed to mention anything about DEI in these interactions? Where does social advocacy fit in with these interactions? Amy?
I think that's a personal choice to lead for every individual. In some environments, it may not be advantageous for you to lean into that. It depends what the goals, what goals you have going into the meeting. For other policymakers, that may resonate with them very deeply, and they may be willing to share personal feelings about that. So ask yourself what you want out of this meeting.
Fantastic. I do have something that's come in on the chat that's relevant to this, which is to point participants who are on the call, anyone and everyone, you can take a look at the PAC, which is another ASBMB committee. Amy's over on the public outreach committee. Is that correct?
It is correct.
I'm over on the PAC, which is the Public Affairs Action Committee. And there is, through the PAC, there's an Action Center resource, which includes a list of tools that we are continuing to develop. I'm going to copy and paste that link into the chat momentarily. But there are resources through ASBMB as well. Now the questions come in. What strategies do you have to continue science communication when you get minimal or no response from those who you've reached out to?
I often think it's helpful to enlist partners. And when I say that, I mean, think about other stakeholder groups with whom your policymaker may already have a relationship. Maybe it's patient advocacy groups, maybe it's a teachers union. Think about somebody with whom you can share priorities and see if you'd be willing to meet together. I think that's often a really helpful strategy. The spotlight doesn't get smaller when you include more stakeholders, it only gets bigger.
Next question up. And I think this actually gets over, I'm well aware of a program that Sean's organization is involved with that helps out with this. So let's start it with Amy and Sean. If you want to weigh in, maybe that might be worthwhile as well. What models exist for embedding scientists within government agencies, and how effective are they?
I have less experience with this, so I think I should pass this over to Sean, who, as a representative of AAAS, represents one of the very best programs in this area.
Well, I appreciate it. Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, so AAAS has a fellowship program called the Science and Technology Policy Fellowships, often referred to just as STPF, that places scientists both in the administration, so the executive branch agencies, Department of Energy, Department of Defense, NASA, NIST, NOAA, DOE, etc. And then they also have a separate one that runs in tandem in Congress, congressional branch fellowships. I believe that the congressional branch fellowships ranges every year anywhere from 30 to 40. And then in the administration, it's in the hundreds. I think it's like 100 to 150 per year, depending upon applications and stuff. It's incredibly competitive, but they do really, really important work. So usually what happens is they'll work in a congressional office for a year. And then oftentimes the staff that I interact with on a professional basis are our former fellows. So they stay on and become full-time professional staff members in Congress, and the same in the administration. It's actually how a lot of PhD scientists end up starting a career both in Congress and the administration.
Thank you, Sean. And I will note that as a member of the ASBMB PAC, I go to Capitol Hill once a year and have had the pleasure of meeting some AAAS STP fellows in some of the Senate offices. They are very clear that they are fought over by the Senate offices trying to get those individuals into into specific places. So it's a very highly thought of program for I think from the legislative side as well. Sean, if you could do us a favor while I move on to the next question, we've got someone asking if you could please put a link to the AAAS program there in the chat for everyone. That'd be great. Moving on, actually, I've got another person weighing in here with some comment on this. Jefferson Science Fellows are run by the National Academy, place the senior scientists in the State Department, and regrettably, the late, great USAID. So that's another option that's being pointed out by another attendee here. I've got Amy back to you for two final questions, and then we'll transition over to Sean's presentation. Amy, can you recommend sources for data on how current policies have diminished local educational institutions, including colleges? Any source currently listing grants canceled or in jeopardy?
I wish I understood better what's currently happening in terms of how our federal Department of Education is going to affect local educational institutions. Probably all of you have an appreciation for the idea that a lot of federal money passes through to state and local, but it'd be difficult for me to go into that in any great detail. I know the ASBMB advocacy page has some resources, and I have to go click out and look this up, but I know Science Magazine is doing a good job of covering some of these issues as well.
Last question from the audience, Amy, is a specific one, I think one on many of our minds regarding the administration's changes in his views towards DEI and programs to support those. The question asker is asking explicitly, can economic status help as a replacement for DEI questions? I think that's a fantastic question. I don't know if anyone's got a good answer to that. Would you like to weigh in?
I'd be eager to try spinning things in those terms. You know, I live in a state that brags on its economic engine very frequently, and also talks about the idea that people can, that there's class mobility, and what a great thing that is. So I think you would need to find a balance between suggesting that we could all just pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and other considerations. But I think looking at things through that lens may resonate with policymakers where DEI does not.
Amy, I'm going to take moderator's privilege and ask you one final question. Can you share a story of a surprise you had when interacting with some of these state legislators or their staffs? I think I may have heard one or two changes in your accent or tone as you were talking about, for example, the supermajority that you have in Utah, where maybe that gives a very strong impression that people are going to think X, but in your one-on-one or small group interactions, you might have more to talk about. Can you share a vignette from that?
I've been surprised how much negotiation happens behind the scenes and is actually quite friendly and crosses party lines. I don't think that's something that a lot of us are privy to. You know, you might have to follow the status of a bill from its first ideas all the way to it being signed. But in reality, I think we're all delivered a narrative that's very conflict driven because conflict sells, right? It's great clickbait. Where in reality, it can be much more nuanced, and there's a lot more bipartisanship even within a supermajority than I ever would have considered.
Thanks for sharing. Thank you to everyone who submitted some great questions for Amy. We have to move on over to Sean's presentation. Sean, welcome. You've got the floor.
Appreciate you. Thank you. Let's see if I can share here. Okay. All right. So just to give you a quick primer again on my background, where I'm coming from, I am not a scientist. I have a political science background from Villanova University, and then I got a master's from Georgetown University in public policy while I was working on Capitol Hill as a legislative staffer. So I worked on the House of Representatives side for about 8 years for approximately 5 different members of Congress, handling a wide range of issues from veterans and military affairs. That I come from a big military family, and that was my passion going into working in politics and policy. And then the last member of Congress I worked for was actually a PhD physicist by training, and he was a guy named Rush Holt from New Jersey, and he used to run the Princeton Plasma Physics Lab, PPPL. And I ended up doing his science and technology portfolio. So I would meet with a ton of scientists coming into his office because they felt very safe coming to talk to him as a fellow PhD scientist. And he actually used to be in the 80s a science and technology policy fellow. That's one of the ways in which he got his start in science policy. And I developed a good background and experience in dealing with science policy and how it's communicated and how it's received on Capitol Hill and with policymakers. And so just to give it quick and skinny, my talk usually is someone now who works at AAAS, and I meet with members of Congress and their staff all the time to talk about science and science policy and why it's important, how the context of which it lives, etc. And so when I talk to this community, I try and give you my experience, both as a former staffer and someone who talks about it now, how it's received, some tips. And a lot of what I do is actually just context setting. One of the things that happens to the scientific community is that they look at things through their lens, which is totally understandable. But on Capitol Hill, I usually say Capitol Hill and Congress especially is the customer service agency of the entire country. They deal with everything from troops in Afghanistan to water runoff on the highways to how planes take off and land to education and everything in between, right? Science is part of that, but they're not thinking about it all the time. And so while it might seem very personal to us, it exists in a greater pantheon of things that legislators and policymakers have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And so basically my 2 tips on when you're approaching talking to policymakers and their staff is know your audience and tell your story. Know your audience is, I'm going to get into some of the details of that as I go throughout my talk here, but basically it's just doing your homework. What committees are they on? How long have they been in Congress? What issues do they care about? You can Google most members of Congress and see immediately what they're putting out to their constituencies and what they're doing in the news and social media, and get a sense of what they care about or what they want you to think that they care about, what their background is, etc. And then the reason that storytelling is so important is, scientists and scientific community, and this is a strength, deals a lot in data and statistics and numbers. That's a good thing. However, when you're communicating the importance of these things, you have to do it in a narrative form, because that's basically how politicians and especially how humans communicate to each other. You can't just plop down an Excel spreadsheet of data on someone's desk and say, well, this is the solution. You should care about it now. You have to weave it into a compelling narrative to say, why is this important? Why does it matter to your community, to your state, your constituency, to your district, et cetera? And why is it worth either time, attention, or money? This is the part of this is the part of what I've been doing lately with folks, given the current Trump administration and the environment that we're living in. Just to paint a picture, a lot of people are surprised by Doge and what's going on. And as someone who worked on the Hill, I'm not. We have been dealing with debts and deficits for a very, very long time. And while I am surprised actually that there's so much action going on in Congress, in the administration about it, I started in Congress in 2007. I worked there until about 2015, 16. Debt and deficits has been part of the conversation forever. And I like giving this pie chart. So this is the proposed FY 2024 budget. And I want you to take a look at that dark maroon piece of the net interest. So you have defense discretionary, you have non-defense discretionary, and then you have what's called mandatory spending. So Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, other mandatory and net interest is things that are on auto payment in our government. It's just a promise made by the American government to its people that we're going to pay these things. The interest on our debt now is exceeding $1 trillion per year, meaning that even if we were to cut $1 trillion in spending, we would still only break even in terms of paying our credit card bill. this has been a talking point of both parties, frankly. You know, Bill Clinton was big on this and others, and they're trying to grapple with it. And so this next graph, and so this is an old one. This is from 2016. I'm working on updating this, but I want to just give a context of where scientific discretionary spending lives. And so if you look at that purple piece, that non-defense discretionary, that's where all the money from NSF, DOE, NASA, NIST, NOAA, all of it lives. And so when folks are going up to the Hill and they're talking about the importance of research at NIH or the Department of Energy, et cetera, this is the context in which a staff up there will understand where that lives and understand its impact. So as you can see, they can zero out non-defense discretionary and it still won't make a difference in the rest of the budget. But where they're working on now is that they're trying to tinker with, okay, well, how do we save? What do we do? And it is aggressive. This is the most aggressive move, I think, in recent history. I don't think there's any argument about that, about spending and what to do with it and how to reorganize it. But I always like, you know, people are sometimes come to me lately, and, you know, a lot of what we do at AAAS is trying to communicate what's going on in Capitol Hill and government to the scientific community. They're like, what's going on? What is the impetus for this? And that's why I wanted to start out with this. This is kind of the agenda setting, the context setting of where spending lives. And now our interest on our debt has eclipsed our defense discretionary spending. So that red portion, we spend more on defense than I think it's the next 9 nations combined. And now the interest on our debt has eclipsed spending on defense. Again, it's exceeded somewhere around $1 trillion. So this is what's causing a lot of the concentration. People are trying to figure that out. Now, there's no, you know, right or wrong way to deal with this. It's a value proposition, and policymakers have to deal, you know, they have to make decisions, and there's good decisions and bad decisions depending upon how you feel about where to spend money. But this is one thing I usually like to say is like, what's going on? And this is kind of like just the brass tacks of the environment that they're living in and all that stuff. And so it also, as Amy alluded to, it paints the picture in the context of when you're talking about your research, and people have already suggested in the comments, hey, can we phrase in pivot or position our research in economic terms? I absolutely would suggest, if you can do that truthfully, to do that. It matters. And I'll answer more questions about this if you guys have at the end, but I just wanted to start this up front. So this is about the background of doing your homework. It's no secret, most, and this is for the 118th Congress, I have to update it for the 119th, but this is, you know, the background of most representatives and senators. Most of them have served either at their local level before coming to the federal level. They have a business background, law and education, before it gets down to, I think that there's a couple engineers, there's one PhD physicist still in the House, some engineers by background for their bachelor's degrees and whatnot. So anybody that has a PhD going up to the Hill is likely to not find both staff and a member who has that kind of background. However, they will understand it and learn it. But it's good, again, in the context setting to know. A lot of people, this is more of the brass tacks when you're going up to. I like to do this in terms of just setting a space of who you're going to meet with when you go to the Hill. A lot of people are unfamiliar with how it goes. Typically, there are 10 people. So there are 435 House offices and then 100 Senate offices, as you guys know. Each office is a small business. They have to do the same job, but they operate a little bit differently than each other. But this is typically the hierarchy of what goes on. I worked on the left-hand side here in the policy shop. I was a legislative assistant and a legislative director. They're the ones, if you meet on scientific issues, that you'll end up meeting with, but they fall within the greater context of everything that goes on here. There's communications and the press secretary. There's not a staff alive on the Hill now that doesn't understand the impact of social media. Social media has literally changed the DNA of how Congress operates. And then there's people who in-process and out-process mail and calls and scheduling and all of that stuff. But this is typically your flow chart of how a congressional office operates. This is what they look like when you go in. They're very small. The buildings were built in the 1960s, and they haven't been updated, even though the population of the United States keeps on growing. Each member of Congress represents roughly 700,000 people. And then the Senate offices are apportioned staff and resources actually based on population. So California and Texas have a bigger staff than, say, Delaware. This is one thing about communicating your science to policymakers that I like to try and demonstrate and illustrate to folks. There's so much information now out there The difficulty for staff is to find credible, valid, and useful information for the decisions that you're making. And this is where I often talk about being an honest broker, where scientists, you are absolutely entitled to your opinion on every single issue that you care about and that you're passionate about. However, if you're communicating your science, it is important to try and be as honest a broker as you can about the field of study that you are an expert in, and then clearly delineating that on something else that you might care about. And you're not speaking as a PhD scientist on something that might not be scientific. Because as a staffer, I was always searching for resources that I could rely on, so that if I was preparing a memo for the congressman I work for, and he was going to go take a vote on the floor of the House of Representatives or to give a speech, and he needed data or anecdotes on something that was going on, my job as a staff was to try and find those sources of information, individuals, institutions that I could glean information, I could ask for information from, and then say, hey, look, I need data on XYZ, and that I could trust it, and that it wasn't, biased or politicized or stretched. There's a lot of people that reach out to Capitol Hill who give fudgy information, and they try and, gloss over some things that maybe are bad and hype up things that they think are good. And so staff are in a rock and a hard place often of trying to find what is true and valid, and that they can present that they're a member of Congress do. So that's always important. I like giving this. Staff are run ragged. They're mostly young. The pay on Capitol Hill is very, very low, and the hours are very, very long. They're expert researchers, but they're typically a jack of all trades and a master of none. I like to give this about all the information. When I would get into an office, I would spend my morning usually on my particular issue areas, whether it was veterans or military or science or energy. I tried to compile as much as I could in these email kind of like groups of information on what's relevant, on what I want to care about that day. And they're constantly watching the news. C-SPAN's always on in the background on the floor of the House. They're just drinking from a fire hose. They're getting information all the time. And again, their job is to suss out what's valid and true and what's useful and important to their district and their constituencies. This is more of a civics 101. I present this to kind of give people an understanding that, Congress is a institution that has traditions. The buckets of so this is the Commerce, Science, and Technology Committee. This is oversight, as you can see in the bottom left, of NSF, NASA, NIST, and OSTP. This is on the Senate side. This is how staff think about where their responsibilities and jurisdictions are. This is part of doing your homework of when you go and talk to staff. So sometimes even when I'm going to talk on someone on the Science, Space, and Competitiveness subcommittee, I know that they also are staff that do, say, the FAA, as you can see here on the right-hand side. And if they're doing an FAA reauthorization bill, they're not going to have time for me, or they're going to be busy and distracted with other things. This is kind of the important work of knowing what's going on Capitol Hill and paying attention. And also, if you have resources at your individual, either university or professional society, usually those folks have government affairs folks like me, and they'll educate you on what's going on in the Hill and try and help you out there. A lot of people always ask me how people are placed on committees. There's one phrase I like to use in Congress, is that it pays to be a winner. Typically, you're not on a committee that matches your background. A lot of times people are on committees for fundraising purposes and other things. They're stacked in such a way that even if they lose one or two members of their own party, they will be able to pass a bill, because it's just simple winner take all majority in Congress. And I can go more into that if you guys have questions. A skinny thing on where science lives too, and this is an important one, especially the first bullet. The difference on science for policy and policy for science. I'm going to fly through this, but happy to extrapolate. Basically, these are the two ways that buckets or frames that you can think about science policy. Science for policy is data expertise that informs the decision-making process. So think COVID or climate change or Alzheimer's research or cancer research. This is data that helps inform policymaking. Policy for science is, say, more funding for the National Science Foundation. So 2 years ago, there was this bill, around 2 years ago, there's a bill called Chips and Science Act, and it literally created a new directorate at the National Science Foundation. That is policy for science. That is literally shaping how science is going to be done and where to put priorities and interests. It's good to understand those two worlds when you're going up and see which one you live in. typically when I interact with scientists, they're on the first one, the science for policy, data to present, to say, hey, look, my research is worthwhile. This is what's going on. Policymakers, staff find that very, very useful. And then the bottom bullet here, the purpose of Congress, a lot of what you see in the news is just noise. As Amy mentioned, there's a lot of the old phrases, if it bleeds, it leads. The sensationalistic aspect of social media is just an outgrowth of what cable media did for a really long time. They want to get your attention, etc. Often people miss out on the purpose of Congress and what's going on behind the scenes. I always say the purpose of Congress is to pass laws and then to fund stuff, and it rarely passes laws. Every Congress is 2 years, so we're in the 119th right now. They passed about 400 bills. About 300 of those are useless. They're naming post offices, or they're just resolutions that don't really do stuff. I would say anywhere from 50 to 100 actually do things, and most of those are what they call appropriations bills. They fund things. So we just passed the continuing resolution, as I'm sure you guys all know, a couple weeks ago. That's all about how to fund the government and whatnot. That's where the Constitution stipulates for Congress, especially it originates in the House of Representatives. They take their power of the purse very seriously. This is an example I like to throw out there. People often ask me, hey, how do I learn how to communicate my science in a storytelling fashion? This award, I can go more into this in the Q&A session. This is a fantastic resource. You can just type in Golden Goose AAAS. This is how to communicate your science to policymakers in a storytelling narrative way. This is one of the best examples I can give. I love this award. We do it every year. We actually have it in the Library of Congress, which is adjacent to Capitol Hill. We have members of Congress come. It's all speaking about the importance of research and the impacts that it has on the economy, on health, on livelihoods, everything. So these are just some helpful tips. And again, I'm happy to go over these if you're ever going up. Amy mentioned the elevator pitch. I usually tell people I have actually literally experienced when I was with some of the members of Congress I was with, we would go into an elevator, and members of Congress actually have a pin on their lapel that says that they're a member. And I've had members that just meet random constituents or Americans walking around, and they're like, hey, what are you here for? I'm a member of Congress. Tell me what you care about. And they had 30 seconds, from when the elevator door shut to when it opened, and then my boss was gone, and they couldn't believe it. They're like, oh my gosh, that was an actual elevator pitch. So try and condensing your science and what's important down. I knew I flew by 1,000 things here in the short time that I had, but I wanted to leave some for Q&A. This is just a map of how Capitol Hill is laid out. On the left-hand side, the buildings 7, 8, and 9, or excuse me, 8, 9, and 10 are the House of Representatives. That's where your members of Congress are. On the right-hand side, which is north, that's the Senate, and then in front of you, you see the Supreme Court is number 4, and the Library of Congress is number 5, and the Capitol is number 14. This is, whenever you go, you can actually walk outside. You can spend a good chunk of time visiting your members. You'll see that it's awesome. I love the American experiment in government. It really is a representative democracy. I usually do not feel afraid to go up there and to talk to your members of Congress. It's their job. They represent you. They're paid to do it. Most of them are extremely people persons. They love meeting with you, staff. I would have meetings day in and day night. Best education I ever got. But anyways, I always encourage people to go up. It's not that daunting once you get there. And again, there's a lot of resources. But so that concludes my spiel. Sorry for talking 1,000 miles a minute, but I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
No apologies needed, Sean. A lot of good information there, and we've got a number of questions in the Q&A that I'd like to start getting into. First of which, on the don't be daunted and the people person front, a question asker says, Sean, I and many I know have the impression that science is under attack and currently has few friends in Congress. Is this your experience? Is there a shift in that direction? Thoughts?
So this might not be a great answer, but no. And the reason I say that is science, and this is what I meant at the beginning about context setting. Science lives at universities mainly, right? So most of the institutions don't do intramural research. They grant it out to extramural research, as you all know. And because it happens at universities, science is now intermixed with the politics of Israel-Palestine, of DEI, of elitism in higher education. Science itself, when you poll both Americans and policymakers about specific things about science. Do you want more Alzheimer's research, cancer research? Do you want things to figure out semiconductors or quantum? Americans time and again say yes. They trust science and they trust scientists. Now, COVID, certainly in the terms of trust of science, really took a hit. And we just, in the scientific community, we have to understand some things we did not do great. And it was one of those things that it intersected with such a personal aspect of people's lives. As we all know, education, masks, jobs, closures, all of that stuff. My CEO of AAAS often talks and uses this phrase, which I completely agree with, is that trust is built in teaspoons and lost in buckets. There was a lot of trust lost over the past 5 years, and the job now is to regain it. However, even with that note, I will say, again, if you're talking individual science, when you're going up there and talking research, members of Congress and their staff love meeting with students, PhD, graduate students, postdocs, mid-career. They love it because they get to understand what's going on. That is the future. They understand the importance of research and what it's going towards and all of that. And again, most of the attacks you see on education at this moment, it's not directly on science. Science is now implicitly involved, and there's good and bad to that, right? Again, if you were to extrapolate and pinpoint just science, in my opinion, most people would not have a problem with it. They want to continue funding it. Health sciences, NIH, is incredibly popular on Capitol Hill. A lot of times you hear about these continuing resolutions and government shutdowns, etc. However, if you type in the AAAS R&D budget program, we have a lot of good graphs that just show continued increase in funding, both in Republican and Democratic administrations over the past 20 years for science. It's gone up, even as a percent of GDP, even with inflation. Typically, members of Congress, through their actions, end up supporting it. And I like telling that, even though I know folks in this current climate are concerned, historically, it should buoy you that both Americans and their institutions support science.
Yeah, I speaking personally, I take a lot of solace in those historical perspectives, but it is disheartening, I think would be the adjective I'd choose, at a point where there are some very direct attacks on some, and I think attack is the only word that can be used, on some fundamentals of how we get funded. Seeing that grants are getting stalled, not getting reviewed, the indirect cost cuts, et cetera, et cetera. It would be nice to see some folks on the Hill step up and become more vocal advocates for stop the silly business, please. Let's get back to having our science discovery engine run it with all cylinders instead of where we're currently at, my personal opinion. Something coming in, a question from someone who is lucky enough to be in an area where there's no question about support. The question here is, for those of us with solidly supported members of Congress representing us, what can we bring to a meeting to help those members be our most effective advocate?
So yeah, I'll give a quick and dirty answer on this one, and Amy might have something to add as well. If you're meeting with a member that isn't a scientist, but you want them to become a champion, right? Most people have something in their family history, in their bio, in their life experience that is touched by science in some way, particularly if you think about it in health science, whether it's a family member with diabetes or someone that is impacted by research. If you get them to understand that nexus and the reason that the research, you connect how the research is done, why it's important, and the impact it has on their lives, and then you talk to them about why, particularly if you're meeting with your local representatives and your university or your institution is in their district and it employs X amount of jobs and it has X amount of economic impact, policymakers understand that they understand that right away. They care about jobs and closures, and they care about the economic mobility of people in their district. They don't want any institution to lose people and workers. That's just one quick and skinny example of taking what you do, painting it in a larger context of why it might be important to them, and then again tying the work that you do throughout that whole narrative.
Sean, I'm gonna send one last question over to you specifically, and then I'd like to open the floor to everyone to submit questions that both Sean and Amy might be able to answer from their different perspectives. I've got one of those queued up from some that came in very end of Amy's Q&A that I'll bring up. But others, please, if you got questions for both panelists now, please put them in the Q&A. Sean, the one specific one I've got for you was back to your comment about your time as a congressional staffer and really having to quickly assess if a source of information was valid, credible, and useful. How did you personally run people through that gamut of valid, credible, and useful when you were having those meetings?
Yeah, I would say twofold. One was just doing basic tests that I could. So if you gave me, so for instance, I'll give you a bad one. So a lot of times defense contractors would come in and talk to me about a base in our district or a facility in our district, and they would say they employ so many people. I would try the best of my ability to look up if those numbers were valid. And if they weren't, you lost all my trust because you just lied to me about what happened, and you gave me an inflated thing. On the useful and valid side, there are resources that staff have, and it's basic Google searches and whatnot, but there's the Congressional Research Service. I would try and see if the numbers I was using or someone was giving me lived in the universe of where other people said to. And if they didn't, why? If they could give me a good explanation. And same thing it's that most scientists are great at, citations, trying to figure out where the information is coming from. The valid one is that's really key. And then the useful, right? Again, that's kind of situation dependent. But I'll give an example and throw out here that's relevant to this community. One of the times that I was working in Congress, we were going to renew the R&D tax credit. So where companies get a tax credit for doing research and development on their own. I needed good data on the ROI, the return on investment on that. What is the economic benefit? Now, most of that is social science, right? It's economics, it's projections. Everyone doesn't really have these like straight up, you put money in here, you get money out there. But if they could give it to me in a clear and understandable way, if they could map it, and then they gave me their methodology, I loved it. Because in essence, those were the questions I was going to be asked. Because people were like, hey, you're using these numbers. Where do they come from? How'd they get them? How trustworthy are they? And yeah, so it's important to do that. And I think most people have a sense too of even among themselves, where do they get unbiased information from? And when they say unbiased, well, how does unbiased reach you? How do you feel as it's not giving you, one too slanted of a lens or not? And then you learn that, and then you try and replicate it.
Fantastic. Question that came in that I think both of you have weighed in a little bit on, I'd like to pull on that thread a bit, is one of the attendees is asking, we've heard from both of you within the Utah State Legislature from Amy and within Congress from Sean that there's a lot of smoke and drama that gets shown publicly, but then behind the scenes there's more bipartisanship, there's more effort to work together. The question asker is going to the heart of this of how much does friendship play a role in this? This individual said that they have met so many people, and the only way to really change minds and get people to evolve their positions is really on trust. Something you touched on, Sean. How much time and effort does it take to develop relationships at a level like that, where you can really see meaningful change and working together, even if the easy thing to do is to not work together? Amy, Sean, you guys want to take that?
I can start, and Amy, you can give your experience as well, especially running. Look, I sometimes I guide people towards committee transcripts. So if you watch C-SPAN, if you're a big nerd like me, and you watch C-SPAN, you have the coverage of the floor of the House, which is really partisan and it's colorful and all of the stuff. However, there's C-SPAN 2, 3. There's other channels that are covering committee hearings. Now, most of the clips that people have seen typically are the really hot and heavy partisan ones from members of Congress on both sides that love clicks. However, I would say if you look at the first committee hearing of this year on the House Science Committee, it was on the state of science and how competitive we are. And you would see an incredible bipartisan, really good substantive discussion about the state of science, how's it funded, where we're going, what members of Congress themselves bring up that they care about, both personal and that relates to their district. There's a lot of business done behind the sensationalistic camera because Congress has a job to do, and they know that. And there are friendships formed, particularly if members have been there for quite some time.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, the chairs of the committee. So I always say we have a new chair, Dr. Babin. He's a dentist from Texas who is chairing the House Science Committee. But previously it was Frank Lucas from Oklahoma,
Mhm.
and he got along great with both Eddie Bernice Johnson, who is now deceased. She was the long reigning chair on the Democratic side. She was good personal friends with Mr. Lucas, and same with Zoe Lofgren, who's congressman from outside LA. Those relationships do exist. You just don't see them highlighted a lot.
Amy, you want to win?
Yeah, I can follow up Sean's comments. I find the bipartisan friendships that I know about are some of the most inspiring, right? They break down the narrative that we hear constantly, that we should be siloed in our own little camps and not talk to each other about our meaningful problems, right? I am grateful to be personally friends with a few representatives on the state level, but we have a citizen legislature, right? That's why they're only up on Capitol Hill 45 days a year and for a few interim session days. But yeah, I have my dog because I'm friends with my state senator. That's she gave me a call when it needed a rescue. Now it lives in my house.
I've got to ask, does the dog's name reflect its genesis in your home?
It does not.
Uh,
It's named Puggy, the most basic name a pug can have.
but still. All right. All good. I will note, Sean, to your point on being the political geek a little bit with my ASBMB PAC service, I've begun watching a few more C-SPAN coverages of specific sessions, and I am stunned when I see someone open their mouth from a part of the country and a party affiliation that one might not associate as being pro-science, and seeing some absolutely fantastic questions and cares and concerns come out. There's a story. Yeah, there's a story behind a story. And in the current era, it's also worth noting for folks, the national level at least, we are not in a supermajority situation. We have very tight roles in both the House and the Senate. Hopefully a few folks just changing their point of view is enough to change the decision from point A to point B. Fingers crossed. Another question from the floor for both Amy and Sean. Hell, what's your best advice for people who have never reached out before? What should a rookie speaker know to have prepared before going into that meeting?
Amy, you want to start
Sean,
with
I
this one?
think I was going to say, Sean, I think you already gave some of the best advice and the advice that I think I wish I had going in the first time I gave testimony before a committee hearing at the state level. Have a 5-minute version, a 3-minute version, have a 30-second version, because it's not fun to do that completely on the fly, right? But sometimes meetings run long. Sometimes there are way more people lined up to speak than you would have thought otherwise. But the other is to just go in with somebody else who already has experience. Everybody likes to help, is the truth.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. Practice makes perfect. We run a workshop at a AAAS called CASE, where we have 150 students from across the country come in. And on the third day they're there, they visit their policymakers. And one of the essential components, even though we give like a 2-day boot camp on everything that I covered in my talk today and Amy covered, at the end of it, day before we go, I make them do mock presentations. And it's a painful process. It sucks to hear yourself talk and to see videos of yourself talk, all of it. But it really winnows down, hey, how is this being received? How am I presenting this? And then you get feedback. And yeah, have friends listen to you, have your family listen to you about how you talk about your research. Is just really important.
All right, on this front, we're getting near the end of our scheduled time. Amy, Sean, I'd like to invite both of you to share any final thoughts or key takeaways that you'd like audience members to leave this session with. Thoughts? Amy first.
Oh gosh, just that I'm more optimistic in the face of the relationships that I have with people on both sides of the aisle than I would be otherwise. Those relationships can really bolster you in times when, if you just otherwise are doom scrolling, then you would feel pretty bleak. So keep reaching out to form those relationships.
Right. Sean?
No, that's great advice. I'm an optimist by nature, and I would say the more you get involved, the more you see how the process works, I think the more hopeful you will become. Because it doesn't reflect, as Amy mentioned, the doom scrolling and the headlines and whatnot. And I always say, if your message works in good times, it works in bad times. I don't think the preeminent message of the scientific community has changed one bit. If the work was worth it during times of surplus, you defend it the same way during times of deficit or challenge. I don't think the scientific community's message has to change that much. I think that the work is always there to renew that message, right? And you got to understand too, most Americans are not scientists. They're not in universities. It takes a lot to reach out, to meet them where they are, but it's worth it. And that's usually the message I give, is that there's a silver lining in all of this. And in a sense, you might get what you perceive to be someone who is not on your side to understand the importance of what you do eventually. Because I do think the message is consistent. So I'm an optimist.
On that optimistic note, thank you, Sean. Thank you, Amy, for your time and expertise today. And a big thanks to all of you who attended and joined us. We really appreciate your participation and interest in science advocacy. With that, concludes our webinar. Everyone, please have a great day. Take care. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.